Hi, and welcome to my studio. It's Elizabeth from Botanical. I just got back from collecting shells and algae on the beach with my friend who was visiting from Georgia. She wanted to check out the plants that grow in the beach dunes and see if there was anything that washed up on the beach that we might want to add to our nature journals. Stone Harbor is a small beach town with a natural area at the southernmost point. We were lucky that it was a really windy day and we had the beach mostly to ourselves. We found tons of shells and algae, but we got sandblasted. When we got back from the beach, we spread out our collection of algae and let them dry on trays. Once the algae had dried out, it was pretty fragile. I didn't want to break it while I was moving it around on my drawing paper, so I took a scrap of foam board and pinned my larger specimen to the board. I could lift up the foam board and reposition it as needed, or set it aside if I wasn't able to finish my drawing in one sitting. I used regular sewing pins to attach the algae to the foam core board. For the smaller pieces of algae that I was illustrating, I didn't really need the foam board, so I just drew those freehand. I started my drawings with just a pencil outline, and I went back in and I shaded some of them later. My friend illustrated some of the same species, and she did her drawings in pen and ink. I do most of my nature journaling in a perpetual journal, and I try to stick to a theme of just plants and fungi. Some of these algae specimens were pretty large, so I didn't want them to take up an entire week spread in my perpetual journal. So instead, I turned to the back of the journal and gave them their own separate page. I usually rely on a set of dividers to make my illustrations more accurate. I use the dividers to measure each segment and transfer it to the paper. But because this was a new subject and I wasn't too worried about making mistakes, I decided to just freehand the illustration. These larger specimens of algae that we collected didn't really have a smell when they dried, so they were nice to work from. But we also collected a small specimen of a red algae that smelled absolutely terrible even after it dried. It was tricky to identify the algae, and I think that we had rockweed, but I'm not sure what some of the other species were that we saw. When I was working on this larger specimen of brown algae, I wanted to try to do it without relying on the dividers, like I said before, but I did use them for some parts, at least just to get started. I wanted to tone this drawing to give it a little bit more of a 3D form. So when I started adding the shading and the toning, that's when I made any corrections that I needed to the line drawing, because the line drawing was pretty rough here. I was working fast here, but I also sped up the footage 20 times so you'd be able to see a little bit more of the drawing process. I think it took me about 2 to 3 hours to finish this larger specimen, including the toning, and the smaller specimens took me about 1 hour each, which is pretty good considering that I basically filled up the entire 2-page spread. This was definitely much faster than the way I normally work, so I think it was good practice in improving my speed. From here, I'm just going to continue the drawing and eventually start to work in the toning. Please stay for the end if you want to see the final illustrations. I think we found a lot of interesting specimens while we were out, and it was certainly enough to keep me busy drawing all week afterwards. I hope this inspires you to find new things to illustrate no matter where you are. Speaking of drawing new subjects, it's October, and normally I would participate in Inktober, which is a drawing challenge where you do a new illustration every day based on a series of Halloween-themed prompts. I started late and then had a very busy couple of weeks, so I fell behind and I probably only did 1 or 2 of the prompts. For people who do nature journaling, it can be tricky to find something that fits into every single prompt, but I did find this year that the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators released their own series of prompts, so if you haven't started already, look out for it next year. They call it Sci-Arttober. I think that next year I might participate in that instead.